Dear friends, this is day 1085 of the Russian war of aggression. Terror Russia hit Kyiv with ballistic missiles to retaliate for its oil refineries. Can Russian economy survive the war and sanctions? Danish intelligence raises awareness on the upcoming Russian war against NATO, and new evidence indicate deliberate Russian strike on their own civilians in Sudzha. Let's talk about all this right now. Tonight, combined Russian strike involving drones and ballistic missiles took place in Ukraine. We have reports coming from different Ukrainian establishments indicating that Kyiv was the primary target of the strike. Ukrainian air defense worked really well, intercepting 6 out of 7 ballistic missiles and 71 drones. This time I didn't find any reports on damage sustained by civilian infrastructure. However, at this point we have 3 cases of fire in different districts of Kyiv due to the remains of the Russian missiles. And 1 man unfortunately died in an office building. Also, we have a number of wounded people, including a 9-year-old. Earlier, it was reported that some of the biggest Russian oil terminals in Ust-Luga and Saratov were hit on the Russian territory. Ust-Luga is some of the biggest Russian terminals located in St. Petersburg. That's the main hub for all those shadow fleet vessels that you can often see cruising in the Baltic waters. Saratov refinery, again, some of the biggest Russian refineries, producing around 20 different types of fuel and processing around 7 million tons of oil per year. This refinery was hit yesterday night with a massive fire reported by the witnesses. At this point, it's hard to estimate the decrease in oil production in Russia because last year Kremlin classified this information to calm down the Russians. Traditionally, they can say on the Russian TV that the terrorist federation produces even more oil than before, and of course the population will happily believe. Recently, terror Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin acknowledged that the country's economic growth might slow in 2025. Generally, what does Kremlin say to its citizens about the Russian economy? Considering Mishustin's and Putin's interviews on the Russian TV, they portrayed the economy as stable despite the international sanctions. What they did not mention, though, was the central bank's interest rate hiking to 21% in October last year. Also, they didn't mention that the Russian National Welfare Fund keeps being emptied every single day to finance the Russian war against Ukraine. Different projections indicate that the fund's liquid assets could be depleted by fall 2025, which, by the way, confirms my opinion that 2026 will be critical for Russia in terms of finances and weaponry. Different indications also show that Russia experiences significant labor shortages. For example, despite having over 1,300 different defense facilities, which employ around 2 million Russians, there is still a shortfall of hundreds of thousands of workers. This shortage makes Russia rely more on the beautiful allies like North Korea for additional weapons and ammunition. For example, as of December 2024, approximately 60% of the shells fired by Russia in Ukraine were sourced from North Korea. Reports from Pokrovsk indicate that the Russian invaders keep trying to encircle the city, being slowed down by growing casualties and shortage of vehicles. The Russians keep utilizing the tactics of smaller infantry groups, which is basically another name for the so-called Russian meat assaults. The Russian progress in this area may seem steady, but it's extremely slow, and it often results in hundreds of Russian soldiers fertilizing the Ukrainian soil on a daily basis in this location. Ukrainian troops, however, managed to counterattack and recapture their positions, like it happened recently in the villages of Pishane and Dachinske. Again, Russians are facing shortage of vehicles and artillery shells. That is the reason we can often see positions around Pokrovsk being recaptured. In Toretsk, however, situation is different. The settlement is mainly destroyed and there's still active combat taking place inside of the settlement, but unfortunately I don't think that it will last much longer because there's not much left to protect. Since it's almost completely destroyed now, I think that it will become one of those ruined ghost towns captured by Russia, like Avdiivka, Rubizhne or Bakhmut. Poland reported that a Russian reconnaissance aircraft Su-24M intruded its airspace yesterday around the Gdansk Strait. The Russians reported that the Russian aircraft suffered navigation issues. Frankly speaking, it's a pity that the Polish air defense didn't suffer an accidental launch issue, could be a good reminder for Russians to stay away from the civilized countries. At the same time, Danish Intelligence Service came up with a disturbing report, my friends. The DIS stated that Russia may start a big war against Europe. According to the Danes, it will take Russia approximately 5 years to prepare for this war, on a condition that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is finished and the invaders have chance to regroup and replace their losses in tanks and personnel. At this point, while Russia spends 1/3 of its budget on the war against Ukraine, obviously it won't risk attacking other countries, but after the war, things may change. The Danish Intelligence Service forecasts a local hybrid conflict in some of the countries bordering the terrorist federation that will spread across the Baltic region with the following full-scale Russian invasion of NATO countries as soon as Kremlin notices a weak spot or a gap in the NATO defense. Earlier last year, German intelligence service also warned that Russia is preparing for a war against Europe, which may happen already before the end of the decade. Again, to those who think that Russia will not attack a NATO member, please look closer at the growing radical movements in your countries calling to exit NATO. That will literally tell you who is your biggest internal threat at this very point. In their media, Russians openly call to strike European capital cities and bring back the old glory by capturing Berlin one more time and destroying Poland with nuclear weapons. And since there's no freedom of speech in the Russian media, you must understand that this is literally the Russian agenda spoken in Russian language and delivered to the Russian population. The fact is, Russians are dreaming of seeing their Spetsnaz stealing toilets in Warsaw, in Prague, in Amsterdam, or Paris, and the very feeling of being able to invade and loot other nations is actually something that fills Russian lives with sense and purpose. If you ever encountered Russian tourists, you probably know what I'm talking about, and also I'm sincerely sorry if you had such experience in the real life. New evidence indicated that Russian war criminals have deliberately hit the boarding school in Sudzha, used as a shelter for the Russian citizens. Alexei Dmitrashkivsky, press officer for the Ukrainian military administration in Sudzha, shared his records he made during the negotiations with the chief of the Russian Kadyrovites, Apti Alaudinov. Turned out that Ukrainian military negotiated a green corridor with the Kadyrovites to make sure that the citizens will be evacuated. On this footage, Russian war criminal Alaudinov confirmed that he was aware of civilian presence in the boarding school before the Russian bomb strike took place. Also, on the footage, he promised to personally organize the green corridor for the Russian civilians, and he said, quote, "If I say that I will do it, I will either keep my word or die." Fact is, Alaudinov never kept his word, and on 1st of February, the Russian aviation hit the boarding school with bombs, killing at least 4 people. It is estimated currently that 6 or 8 Russian civilians may still be buried under the debris. The Russian media traditionally blamed Ukraine for striking the boarding school, which was again controlled by the Ukrainian forces. At the same time, other channels admitted that yes, this was actually a Russian strike, but it resulted in eliminating hundreds of NATO mercenaries hiding in the boarding school. I mean, they always use this version to justify their strikes on schools, hospitals, and kindergartens. The truth is, 100 of Russian citizens, mostly older people with disabilities, were sheltered in the boarding school at the time, and the reason they were there is because when Ukrainian troops incurred the Kursk Oblast, the Russian local authorities in Sudzha abandoned their citizens and ran away from the town. Apparently, they decided to eliminate Russian civilians who could either testify against the Russian authorities or, for example, tell that they were actually cared by and fed by Ukrainian troops, which is something absolutely forbidden in terms of Russian propaganda. With that, my dear friends, I wish you all a beautiful day. Don't forget to share this episode. And of course, I will see you in the commentaries. I'm Operator Starsky. As always, be safe.